Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce myself. My full legal name is Benjamin D. Rhodes. This is the name that I use on my passport, my tax return, my credit card slips, and my bar bill. The rest of the time I prefer just plain Ben Rhodes. Please call me Ben. I would like to make an inane remark at this point, namely, you're looking well. I say this because science has revealed that there are three phases in life. First, there's infancy. Then, after a while, we get maturity. And the final phase of life is, you're looking well. There are quite a few of us, including myself, who have now reached that final, you're looking well phase. I will be presenting on this cruise a series of historical talks about the presidents on Mount Rushmore. From left to right, the fabulous four are Washington, Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Lincoln. In addition, I will discuss several presidents who deserve to be included on Mount Rushmore: Woodrow Wilson, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, Calvin Coolidge, and Ronald Reagan. Finally, I'll cover several presidents who will never make it to Mount Rushmore: Richard Nixon, Herbert Hoover, Warren G. Harding, and John F. Kennedy. I have included Kennedy on the rejection list because of his notorious and flagrant adultery and hanky-panky. Today, my topic is Ronald Reagan and Mount Rushmore. I would like to begin by relating one of Reagan's favorite stories when he served as a master of ceremonies. His tale went like this. In Rome, a huge crowd filled the Colosseum, including the emperor. They had come to see the slaughter of Christians who were to be thrown to the lions. And as the lions charged into the theater, one of the Christians walked up to them and made a statement, whereupon the lions all lay down, leaving the Christians unharmed. At this point, the emperor sent for the Christian who had addressed the lions and asked them, "What in the world did you say that made them all lie down?" And the Christian said, "All I said was that after the meal there would be a long and boring history lecture." Please be assured that I have spoken to the lions at the back of this auditorium, and they are all lying down, and they promise that no one will be harmed. So does Reagan belong on Mount Rushmore? Reagan's admirers, led by Arizona Representative Matt Salmon and Michael Novak of the American Enterprise Institute, say yes. Defend Our Marriages, a Washington, D.C. advocacy group, also supports adding Reagan. Their position is that Reagan should replace Abraham Lincoln because they believe Lincoln was a closet homosexual. So what is their evidence for this crazy idea? They note that before his marriage, Lincoln and his friend Joshua Speed shared common lodgings, including the bed. So what did this prove? The answer is nothing whatsoever. On the Illinois frontier, it was a common practice for lawyers and judges traveling the judicial circuit to sleep in the same bed. The theory that Lincoln was a homosexual is one of the dumbest arguments I've ever heard. On the surface, Reagan should have been a troubled, depressed, morose kid. Born at Tampico, Illinois on February 6, 1911, he was a product of the Illinois Farm Belt, like Lincoln and William Jennings Bryan. But young Reagan had little time for the pleasures of rural life because the Reagans were constantly moving, by one count, 17 times in 18 years. His dad was a drunk who was constantly getting fired, once on Christmas Eve. As the product of an unstable family life, Reagan should have been withdrawn, neurotic, and unsure of himself. But just the opposite was the case. Throughout his life, he was known for his winning smile and self-confidence, and above all, for his sunny disposition. One of Reagan's favorite stories is the pony story. A couple had two children. One was a pessimist, the other an optimist. The parents wanted to cheer up the pessimist and show the optimist that life is not a bed of roses and that there are going to be a few bumps along the way. So they locked the pessimist in a room filled with new toys, and they locked the optimist in a room filled with manure. And after about an hour, they carefully cracked the doors, and here's what they found. First, they found the pessimist crying. He was crying because he was afraid he would break the new toys. And in the other room, the optimist was cheerfully shoveling the manure because, he explained, there was so much of it, there had to be a pony in there somewhere. The life of Ronald Reagan, in a sense, was one long search for that pony. Dutch Reagan, as he was then called, graduated from Dixon, Illinois High School. He also graduated from a little-known college, Eureka College, near Peoria, in 1932. Dutch was a big man on campus. He was student body president, captain of the swim team, and he organized a protest against the school president for the crime of downsizing the faculty. Athletically, he was just average. He made the football team as a reserve guard, but he was too slow and clumsy, and the Golden Tornadoes were losers. In summers, he was a lifeguard at a beach on the Rock River. With a straight face, he later claimed to have saved 77 individuals from drowning, a claim that, like many of Reagan's heroic stories, appears wildly exaggerated. One of Reagan's attributes at any stage of his life was his beautiful voice and his clear and confident delivery. These qualities led him to announcing jobs in Davenport and Des Moines, Iowa. At Des Moines, he did play-by-play broadcasts of Chicago Cubs games, not by seeing the action in person, but by recreating the action by reading wire reports. A sound engineer assisted with piped-in crowd noise. In 1937, during Cubs spring training, Reagan got a chance to switch careers when he broke into Hollywood by acing his Warner Brothers screen test. With his matinee idol, good looks, his fine voice, and his infectious smile, he had all the qualities that made teenage girls swoon. Now he dropped Dutch from his name and became plain Ronald Reagan. According to the conventional wisdom, Reagan was a marginal performer who never graduated from low-budget B films and B roles. In fact, he was not mediocre at all. He appeared in 53 Hollywood films and was cast along such stars as Bette Davis, James Cagney, Claude Rains, Olivia de Havilland, Shirley Temple, Virginia Mayo, Barbara Stanwyck, Jane Wyman, Nancy Davis, Errol Flynn, Humphrey Bogart, and Lionel Barrymore. His best films were Knute Rockne All-American and King's Row. In the Notre Dame film, Reagan played George Gipp, who dies of pneumonia, and says to Rockne, played by Pat O'Brien, "Someday when things are tough and the brakes are going against the boys, ask them to go in there and win one for the Gipper. I don't know where I'll be, but I'll know about it and I'll be happy." In King's Row, Reagan was a quadriplegic who, as he emerges from the anesthetic and discovers that his legs have been amputated, cries out to his wife, played by Ann Sheridan, "Randy, where's the rest of me?" In anguish, he grabbed the bed covers where his legs had been. There was no reason to be nervous. The film crew had cut a hole in the mattress for Reagan's legs. His legs were just fine after the scene was filmed. Reagan was very dependable. He was on time. He paid attention during rehearsals, and he knew his lines such as, "Give me the city desk. I've got a story that will crack this town wide open." His first marriage to actress Jane Wyman was a failure. Their marriage was like a warm bath. At first, it was fine, but after a while, it wasn't so hot. They had 2 children, Maureen and Michael, who was adopted. She tired of Reagan's long-winded stories and found him a bore. He felt she didn't give the marriage a bona fide effort. She filed for divorce in 1949, and Reagan was really devastated. In his memoir, An American Life, published in 1990, Reagan got his revenge. In 2 uninformative sentences, he dismisses Wyman as just another contract player at Warner's. He failed to mention that Wyman won an Oscar for Best Actress in 1948. Without any explanation, he concluded that the marriage didn't work out and ended in divorce. Surely he owed his readers more than that. How did he feel about the divorce? Was he mad, sad, or glad? Or did he worry that a divorce would damage his prospects in Hollywood or in the world of politics? With his Teflon shield in place, Reagan didn't say. It was on the upswing that he met and married actress Nancy Davis on March 4, 1952. She was born in 1921 and was 10 years younger than her husband. Her resume claimed that she was born in 1923, not 2021, and left out that she was 2 months pregnant at the time of their marriage. The Reagans had 2 children, Patty, born October 21, 1952, and Ron, May 20, 1958. So were the Reagans good parents? To call them neglectful would be going too far. But both parents were extremely busy with films such as Hellcats of the Navy, in which they both appeared in 1958. Reagan's film Bedtime for Bonzo is from this period also. Patty was a consistently rebellious daughter. As an infant, she specialized in crying nonstop, and she didn't like string beans, so she just held them in her mouth for hours at a time. Later, Patty scandalized her parents by moving in with a long-haired rock musician. In the meantime, Ron was sent off to boarding school in Claremont, California. At the age of 17, to the shock of his parents, he began an affair with a 30-year-old divorcee. This at least laid to rest the rumor that Ron was homosexual. Reagan's talent for politics was first demonstrated as head of the Screen Actors Guild. He managed to keep on good terms with all factions, and he defended the Hollywood 10, who were hauled before the House Un-American Activities Commission and falsely accused of promoting communism. At this point in his life, he was a good New Deal Democrat, and he supported Truman in 1948 over Dewey, and he voted for Helen Douglas for the Senate in her race with Richard Nixon. In 1960, he reluctantly voted for John F. Kennedy, but he was about to change from a liberal Democrat to a conservative Republican. How can you explain the switch? 2 of the most popular explanations stress the influence of his wife and her stepfather, Dr. Loyal Davis. Luke Hannon, Reagan's biographer, presents a plausible explanation. He argues that Reagan was pushed to switch by anger over his tax bill. Marginal tax rates on high incomes were 70%. This meant that actors whose income might be high in one year and low in the next were unfairly taxed. In his memoir, Reagan claimed with a touch of exaggeration that he was in the 94% tax bracket. The IRS, he recalled, took such a big chunk of my earnings that after a while I began asking myself whether it was worthwhile to keep on taking work. Reagan burst on the national political scene in 1964 when he made a nationally televised speech, A Time for Choosing, on behalf of the presidential campaign of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. It was the same basic speech that Reagan had been making for years. His theme was that America was at a crossroads. The nation had a choice between reclaiming the liberties taken from the people by government bureaucrats or going down the socialist road to ruin. Goldwater's defeat by Lyndon Johnson left Reagan as a shining star in the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Stature soared in 1966 when he was elected governor of California. Edmund G. Pat Brown was the governor of the state, and he had solidly whipped Richard M. Nixon 4 years before. First, Reagan won the Republican primary, defeating former San Francisco Mayor George Christopher. In his campaign, Reagan tactfully followed a policy of never saying anything negative about a fellow Republican. Governor Brown took Reagan lightly, too lightly as it turned out. He said, Reagan is only an actor who memorizes speeches written by other people, just like he memorized the lines that were fed to him by speechwriters in the movies. Sure, he makes a fine speech, but who's writing his speeches? He compared Reagan to a pilot making his first flight who says to the passengers, don't worry, I've always had an active interest in aviation. Brown said that while he was building up California, Reagan was making Bedtime for Bonzo. Reagan got in the last laugh, defeating Brown by 1 million votes. Since he was 56 years old, it appeared that the governorship was the end of the political road for Reagan. Reagan easily won a second term as governor of California in 1970, defeating House Speaker Jesse Unruh with 52.9% of the vote. The main issue was the welfare mess. Reagan attacked welfare queens and said public assistance should go to the needy, not the greedy. The California Welfare Reform Act of 1971 tightened the eligibility for welfare, raised the monthly stipend from $172 a month to $231 a month, and reduced the number of welfare recipients from 1.6 million to 1.3 million. As he left office, he had slowed the growth of state government, increased spending for education, and at the same time he had balanced the budget. How in the world was he able to do this? The answer lay in raising income taxes from a maximum rate of 7% to 11%. In office, Ronald Reagan was a pragmatist, a characteristic he carried over into his presidency. When Ronald Reagan left Sacramento in 1975, he was 64 years old and presumably headed for his ranch at Santa Barbara in retirement. Within a year, he would become eligible for full Social Security benefits and Medicare. But Reagan had another plan, running for president. In 1968, he had made a half-hearted run for the Republican nomination at a time when the party leaders had promised the nomination to Richard Nixon. But Nixon had now resigned in disgrace, and Gerald Ford was finishing his term. Ford offered Reagan a choice of two cabinet positions, Secretary of Transportation or Secretary of Commerce. But Reagan was having none of it. In seeking the nomination against a sitting Republican president, Reagan found an issue, the Panama Canal Treaty. And at the 1976 convention, Reagan barely lost by only 100 votes out of over 2,000 cast. But Reagan's defeat was a blessing in disguise, since Jimmy Carter beat Ford in the presidential election. Ford was headed for retirement. Ronald Reagan was a survivor and the best-known national Republican leader. Jimmy Carter's unhappy term was marked by repeated bad luck and economic reverses. The list included high energy prices, runaway inflation, and the Iranian hostage crisis. So by 1980, Reagan was once again seeking the Republican nomination. His liabilities included his age of 69 and his hearing, which was noticeably slipping. His assets included his ruddy appearance, and his advocacy of supply-side economics. He stressed that government, with its high expenses, was not the solution, but the problem. George Bush, his leading competitor, termed the supply-side theory voodoo economics, but Reagan insisted that cutting taxes would produce an economic flowering. The turning point came in a nationally televised debate at Nashua, New Hampshire. Originally, only Reagan and Bush, the two frontrunners, were scheduled. Reagan then invited 4 excluded candidates to attend and paid the bill for John Anderson, Robert Dole, Howard Baker, and Philip Crane. When the Nashua Telegraph tried to turn off the microphones of the 4 Reagan invitees, Reagan dramatically defended their right to be heard and stated, "I paid for this microphone." Was this statement purely spontaneous? Actually, Reagan, the actor, borrowed the line from the movies. It was originally delivered by Spencer Tracy in State of the Union. In the 1980 presidential debates with Jimmy Carter, Reagan shone. With great humor and charm, he used the phrase, "There you go again," when Carter proposed national health insurance and an expansion of Medicare. He asked the voters whether they were better off than they had been 4 years before. He took the position that a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, a depression is when you lose your job, a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. It was Carter who lost his job in a landslide. There are 2 common scenarios in the popular mind that depict the presidency of Ronald Reagan. First, there is a version I will call Reagan the Hero. The basic theme here is that Reagan restored the confidence and economic vigor of the nation by cutting the onerous federal tax burden. Moreover, his military buildup, which was made possible by the cuts in domestic spending, made America the great arsenal of democracy, and together with his Star Wars missile defense plan, led directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The competing version portrays Reagan as an amiable, thoughtless dunce who knew little when he took office and who was not even slightly interested in mastering details. He was a man dominated by his wife Nancy, whom he called Mommy, and both Reagans were manipulated by astrologers such as Joan Quigley. He did very little real work and spent his days swapping tasteless, stupid stories with his cronies. Reagan was essentially a little boy man with the intellect of a child and the emotional maturity of a Cocker Spaniel. I feel confident that I can take either of these scenarios and make them sound plausible. The Reagan the hero thesis works best for his first term in office, but not so well for the second. Pragmatism was often on display. He tended to rely, like Andrew Jackson, on a kitchen cabinet of advisors, such as James Baker, Ed Meese, and Michael Deaver, and less on his official cabinet, the exceptions of George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger. Recalling the trade wars that had resulted from the Hawley-Smoot tariff of 1930, he rejected demands from the Detroit automakers to impose strict quotas on autos from Japan. After a suicide bomber killed 241 U.S. Marines at Beirut in 1984, Reagan the pragmatist concluded that the United States was caught in a civil war that was unwinnable. So he cut his losses and pulled out. "We are not bugging out," he said. "We are deploying to a more defensive position." When 70% of the air traffic controllers struck in blatant violation of the no-strike clause in their contract, Reagan fired them and began training a new corps of employees. Next, when Justice Potter Stewart announced his retirement, Reagan interviewed an Arizona judge recommended by Senator Barry Goldwater. Reagan found that Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman nominated to the Supreme Court, was the embodiment of integrity and fairness. He was really bowled over by her personality and intellect. The Reagan the hero concept was further buttressed by an enormous across-the-board tax cut, the Kemp-Roth bill. It cut the top income tax rate from 70% to 50%, while the cut in the lowest bracket was from 14% to 11%. In theory, it would be possible to balance the budget, increase military spending, and cut taxes at the same time. The reality was that deficits grew larger and larger. The national debt rose from $997 billion under Carter to $2.85 trillion at the end of Reagan's term. To put this in context, the national debt in April 2012 was $16.395 trillion. In context, perhaps Reagan did not do so badly. In Reagan's opinion, his ability to slash the federal deficit was entirely the fault of congressmen, some of whom are Republicans, who sent him one continuing resolution after another, all loaded with excessive spending. He could not veto the resolutions because then the government would be unable to pay its bills, including Social Security. However, in 1982, Reagan the pragmatist reached a deal with House Speaker Tip O'Neill to accept a $98.3 billion package of spending cuts and tax increases that undid part of his tax cut. When asked why he socialized repeatedly with the liberal Democrat and fellow Irish-American Tip O'Neill, Reagan explained, "Hell, I just like the guy." The passage of the tax cut was assisted by an enormous outpouring of public sympathy for Reagan following the attempt on his life on March 30, 1981. The assassination attempt was similar to past attacks on presidents by disturbed lone individuals. The perpetrator was John Hinckley, who was trying to impress the actress Jodie Foster. As he left the Washington Hilton, Reagan was hit by a bullet that bounced off his bulletproof limousine. The wound was worse than it looked at first. The bullet struck him near the left armpit, collapsed his lung, and lodged near his heart. Throughout the ordeal, Reagan displayed courage and a sense of humor. "Honey," he said to his wife, "I forgot to duck," a line attributed to Jack Dempsey. To the surgeon who was preparing to operate, he said, "I hope you're a Republican." And to a nurse who asked how he felt, he cracked, taking a line from W.C. Fields, "All in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia." The heroic image of Reagan reached its high point in 1984 when he humiliated the Democratic candidates Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. The campaign had not started well for Reagan, as he flopped badly during his first debate with Mondale at Louisville, Kentucky. In his memoirs, Reagan admitted that he had been overtrained and that his stunning performance had been disastrous. When Reagan used the phrase, "there you go again," Mondale reminded him that Reagan had said that to President Carter just before proposing a reduction in Social Security. In their second debate, Reagan made an impressive recovery. With reference to his age of 73, he ad-libbed, "I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." In retrospect, Mondale erred in frankly stating that if elected, he intended to raise taxes. Mondale carried only Minnesota and the District of Columbia. 49 states went for Reagan, and he carried 59% of the vote. Reagan's second term was marked by several serious health issues. In 1985, he had an operation for colon cancer. He also had a small skin cancer removed from his face. 2 years later, at the age of 76, he had the roto-rooter prostate operation. The most serious indication that Father Time was making inroads was Reagan's fading memory. Previously, he had frequently mixed up his facts when dealing with the press. He liked to tell stories of dramatic feats by American pilots that probably came from the Reader's Digest. In 1984, he gave a famously confused explanation of the MX missile project, and in his State of the Union message, he stated that while American and Soviet governments had had serious differences, our sons and daughters have never fought each other in war. Either he left out or was unaware that in 1918, 5,800 soldiers of the U.S. 339th Infantry landed at Archangel under British direction, and before the expedition was recalled in 1919, over 200 were killed. By far the worst example of cognitive impairment on Reagan's part was his memory lapse concerning the effort of Colonel Oliver North and the National Security Council to overthrow the Nicaraguan Sandinistas. In 1984, the Boland Amendment, named for Representative Edward Boland of Massachusetts, banned U.S. government aid to the Contras, who were the opponents of the Sandinistas. To outflank the Boland Amendment, the NSC raised funds for the Contras from friendly governments like the Sultan of Brunei, and by selling arms to the Islamic government of Iran at a huge markup. Supposedly, the Boland Amendment didn't apply to the NSC or the White House, a highly dubious conclusion. When the scheme fell apart, Reagan managed to escape personal blame. North and Admiral John Poindexter claimed they had kept Reagan in the dark to give him plausible deniability. The reality was that Reagan had trouble remembering just what he had agreed to. Reagan's Teflon shield combined with his reassuring voice and manner kept him from harm's way. His fading faculties were summed up in a mean Washington story. The waiter asked Mrs. Reagan, "May I take your order?" "Yes, I'll have the meat and potatoes. And for the vegetable, he'll also have the meat and potatoes." Anyone who enters public life must be aware that sooner or later they will be the target of ridicule. Among the worst put-downs that President Reagan had to live with were the charges that he was a poorly educated mediocrity from a provincial flyover state who happened to excel as a super TV news anchor and used car salesman. With his sunny disposition, Reagan could grin and bear it. He clearly understood the difference between critics and box office. If you had box office, you could ignore the critics, and Reagan had box office. But Nancy Reagan had no Teflon shield, and she lacked the box office appeal of her husband. Consequently, she became a frequent object of ribbing by reporters and late-night TV hosts. She was criticized for luxurious state in clothes and White House furniture in China. She was the porcelain princess who fixed a rapturous gaze on her husband whenever he spoke. She had the misfortune to order new expensive china for the White House on the same day her husband cut funds for school lunches. And Nancy made herself look snobbish by insisting that she be introduced when she gave a speech with a drum roll as the First Lady of the United States. Nancy was tailor-made for Johnny Carson, who said her religion was Christian Dior. Her favorite junk food was caviar. When she accompanied the LA police on a drug raid, Carson claimed she was handing out tickets to women who were caught buying clothes off the rack. When asked whether she understood poor people, she reputedly said yes, but only if they speak slowly. And when asked whether she favored red china, she supposedly said yes, but not on yellow tablecloths. When the Reagans left office in 1989, they returned to the Golden State. They purchased a home in the Bel Air area of Los Angeles and retained their ranch at Santa Barbara. In his memoirs, he said he didn't miss Washington or the job. What he did miss, and this is certainly true, were the people he came in contact with every day. In August 1993, at the age of 83, Reagan announced he had been diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease. In a typically graceful statement, he noted, "At the moment, I feel just fine. I intend to live the remainder of the years God gives me on this earth, doing the things I have always done. I now begin the journey that will lead me to the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there is a bright dawn ahead." At age 89, he broke his hip and spent his final 4 years in virtual seclusion. Nancy Reagan told Larry King that she wanted people to remember Ronnie the way he had been. When he died in 2004 at the age of 93, the Republican Party had endorsed such social issues as right to life and opposed stem cell research as immoral because it made use of discarded embryos from fertility clinics. Mrs. Reagan, on behalf of her husband, broke with party orthodoxy and endorsed stem cell research as providing hope for those afflicted with diseases like Lou Gehrig's disease and Alzheimer's. Should Ronald Reagan be added to Mount Rushmore? My answer is an emphatic yes. The nation that flew to the moon and built Hoover Dam should have no trouble with a little Black Hills civil engineering. To provide political balance to Mount Rushmore, I would propose adding, along with Reagan, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt. That way, there would be 3 Republican presidents, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Reagan, and 3 Democratic presidents, Jefferson, Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt, and finally 1 Federalist president, George Washington. This should make a great public works project. The only real objection I can see is that there would be no room left for Eleanor Roosevelt, Nancy Reagan, Elvis Presley, Rush Limbaugh, or Bonzo. Thank you.